Lucy said, my name is Christopher Bamford, and the title of my paper, as you can see up there, is Finding the Figural in Deleuze and Lyotard. It's quite nice because, although I was anxiously waiting out there, that so many things have been highlighted already that I will recover. You know, it feels like we're already in comfortable territory, I hope. This paper will investigate an interrelationship between the thought of Deleuze and his contemporary Jean-François Lyotard, specifically their writings on fine art, and as the title suggests, their use of the term Figural. It's part of my PhD research into Lyotard's writings on art, and as such, this foray into Deleuzian territory constitutes a line of flight which has forced me to carefully consider the differences among many apparent similarities. Both thinkers write with art and artists, rather than about them. They give prominence to the ideas, statements, and working methods described, and as such privilege the role of the artist as enacting a different type of thought, but one analogous to the philosopher, which I love because I'm from practice background, so I celebrate that aspect of both these thinkers. The importance of maintaining the difference of the visual is central to each, and it is because of the sensitivity to the peculiarities of the visual that their writings strive to work with that difference rather than to reduce it to a written form. Both Deleuze and Lyotard work knowingly with the paradox of writing about art, evoking rather than capturing its force. And it is in wrestling with this dilemma that their approaches can be particularly rewarding. I will discuss two pieces in particular. No surprise, Deleuze's Francis Bacon, The Logic of Sensation, 1981, which is his most extensive writing on a single artist. And secondly, Lyotard's essay, It's as If a Line, which was originally written as a catalogue essay for an exhibition by the Italian artist Valerio Adami, and that's the catalogue. It was then subsequently incorporated into a publication from 1987 called Quépendre. Although Lyotard wrote many pieces on contemporary artists, Adami has been chosen because it highlights aspects of separation and questioning which encapsulate the differing approaches of Lyotard and Deleuze, and necessitates a return to their earlier exchange at the time of the publication of Anti-Oedipus in 1972. Let's start with a Figural. In his book on Francis Bacon, we find many terms familiar to Deleuze's lexicon: sensation, bodies without organs, deterritorialization, or DT for anybody who's wants to do shorthand. But Deleuze also introduces the term Figural, with specific reference to Lyotard's usage of the term in his doctoral thesis, 1971, Discours Figure. This is how Deleuze introduces it. He says, painting has two possible ways of escaping the figurative: toward pure form through abstraction, or toward the purely figural through extraction or isolation. If the painter keeps to the figure, if he or she opts for the second path, it will be to oppose the figural to the figurative. And that's where he has his footnote and acknowledges Lyotard's Discours Figure. Explicitly, Deleuze uses the term figural in order to differentiate Bacon's use of the figure from a representational, figurative approach to painting, and his subsequent use of a capitalised F for figure in reference to Bacon brings with it this distinction. However, the figural is more than just a mark of formal distinction, and encapsulates that which is central to Bacon's work for Deleuze, his striving for a different figuration that avoids cliched representation and which works instead with sensations. Deleuze writes of sensation following Cézanne, but actually takes it from Bacon, as impacting directly on the nervous system, bypassing the modes of communication which need cerebral decoding. The violence of sensation, therefore, is an affective sensation, coming from matter itself. Although the term figural appears only once in Deleuze's book, it is clear that it is more than just a nod to Lyotard, but an acknowledgement of the importance of Discours Figure for the argument which runs throughout the book. This is highlighted by Ronald Bogue, whose account of Deleuze's work on Bacon includes a summary of its main sources. both Lyotard's discours figure and the other principal reference point, Maldenay's Regard, Parole, Espace, which draws on the phenomenology of Erwin Strauss. Bogue gives an overview of Lyotard's use of the figural and acknowledges that whilst Deleuze, quote, does not embrace all aspects of Lyotard's concept, end quote, he relates the figural to sensation and affect, but, quote again, without resorting to the theoretical presuppositions of Freudian psychoanalysis or conventional phenomenology. So Bogue highlights the debt to Lyotard while indicating its difference. I'd like to pick up this branch which has been cut short and look further at where the two part company. This is prompted in part by another recent publication, Simon O'Sullivan's Art Encounters with Deleuze and Guattari, in which Lyotard is frequently quoted, and in fact Simon O'Sullivan says that Lyotard is a continual presence throughout this book, he says. He frequently quotes Lyotard in order to explain and exemplify Deleuze's position. And whilst initially this delighted me, because this is exactly what I was looking at, and I thought, well, fantastic. But then I started to become sceptical, and I thought, well, this implied equivalence, is it too much? So let's return to Discours Figural. It's a detailed and complex work in which the usage and definition of the figural shifts continually, depending on the context of its operation, and that unpredictability is itself part of the nature of the figural. The figural is that which resists systemisation and which remains as a disruptive force within any attempt to create a system. It's the visual element of written language and the non-visible aspect of the visual. It breaks through and makes itself apparent through unpredictable disruption and deformation. Initially, the figural is equated in Discours Figural with the visible, particularly the mobile eye of Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology, which is used to expose the limitations of structuralist linguistics and the assumptions in reading a text. Lyotard calls his work a defence of the eye and investigates, as we've heard in the last paper, the interplay between line as letter and letter as line. And he does this through examples of medieval illuminated manuscripts and in the typographic arrangements of Mallarmé's poetry. But Lyotard is not merely wishing to reinscribe a phenomenological topology or sensibility onto language, but to draw attention to the figural as that which falls outside signification. Not to recoup the referential and the sensible into signification, which is what he accuses phenomenology of doing, excuse me, but to figure the inherent blocking together of the incommensurate. And it is to Freud that he turns the clearest example of this aspect of the figural, as the unpresentable aspect of presentation. Here, the eye becomes located in the workings of desire, and in its most extreme manifestation, Lyotard describes the figural as difference itself. To turn to a concrete example for a moment, both Deleuze and Lyotard refer to the working methods of Paul Klee as an instance of the search for a figuration which attempts to free itself from the restricted modes of perception and formulaic means of representation. They both quote Klee's aim, which comes in his creative credo at the beginning of it. Art does not reproduce the visible, rather it makes visible. Lyotard cites one working method, written of in one of Klee's journals, an early diary entry from 1908, the process of double reversal, by which Klee attempts to control phantasmatic imagery. He says, first draw from nature, then turn the page upside down and emphasise the most important plastic elements, dependent on your will, depending on the translation. And finally, turn it back to face the front and reconcile the whole image in order to create not a merely personal, phantasmatic image, but one which plays with the possibilities that the working has opened up. Klee creates an interworld, his Zweifelsfeld, which Deleuze recognises as a process familiar to those modern artists who play with the chaotic. Yet the psychoanalytic analogy used by Lyotard, and the whole book he shot through with his adaptation of Freud, rests on the process of fantasy formation, which Deleuze and Guattari reject in their Anti-Oedipus. It is useful at this point to consider the reaction of Deleuze and Guattari to Discours Figure, in order to highlight more clearly the extent to which Deleuze's adoption of the Figural is an extension or a removal from that which Lyotard proffers. There's clearly a respect for each other's work. Deleuze writes a short but favourable review of Discours Figure in La Quinzaine Littéraire, and it struck a chord when Ian Buchanan gave his speech at the beginning. He mentioned the idea of an egg, and actually Deleuze says that Discours Figure, it's a good solid egg, and I thought, well, that's obviously a fantastic thing to be described as. This review of Discours Figure, it's a short review, but then some of this review finds its way into one of the three sections of Anti-Oedipus, which discusses Lyotard's work, praising Discours Figure as, quote, the first generalised critique of the signifier, end quote. But having praised his celebration of the figural element as desire, they question the role he gives to transgression, resulting in deformation rather than transformation. And it's worth quoting this at length. So this is from Anti-Oedipus discussing Discours Figure. Despite his attempt at linking desire to a fundamental yes, Lyotard reintroduces lack and absence into desire, maintains desire under the law of castration at the risk of restoring the entire signifier along with the law, and discovers the matrix of the figure in fantasy, the simple fantasy that comes to veil desire in production. The whole of desire is effective production. But at least, for an instance, the mortgage of the signifier was raised. This is the key to the difference between Lyotard and Deleuze and Guattari, certainly at this point, and a difference which can also be seen in the later writings on painting. As indicated in the quotation, transgression and deformation are central characteristics of the figural in Lyotard's writing. It works within the structured systems of representation, and it is through deformation that the presence of desire is signalled. Transgression cannot operate without a limit, however, and as James Williams notes, there is no beyond in the thinking of Deleuze and Guattari, and therefore no transgression. Deleuze and Guattari's desire is not Freud's desire as lack, but desire as force, following a Nietzschean affirmation of desire as will. As such, there can be no absence, lack, nor fantasy in their conception of desire, only immanent potentialities, possibilities of becoming. Becoming animal is one such becoming, recognised by Deleuze in some of Bacon's paintings. It is not, however, a passage from human to animal, but a becoming through the fact of a common zone between man and beast. Deleuze writes that Bacon's paintings are not of faces, but heads, not of flesh, but meat, and this is the zone of indiscernibility where animal traits and animal spirit are actualised. Bacon sees meat not with horror, but as a fact. If we take this as an instance of the immanent, affirmative and transformative desire which concerns Deleuze, we can identify a difference in approach when Lyotard writes of the process of passage, which I think has an equivalence to some extent in Adami, in his writing on Adami. The essay, It's as if a line, is comprised of several voices. And here I've just got a couple of pages from the English translation which appeared in the journal Contemporary Literature. And you can see there that Lyotard uses these four different voices, like a dialogue, and you can see the subheadings there. The different voices he uses are he, she, the other, and then finally me. It's a strategy to hide the philosopher's voice and to allow the line within the pictures to form themselves into words. Consequently, there emerges a polyphonic chorus. But it's the voice labelled the other which appeals to the archaic time of classical mythology and to the passages of metamorphosis. these passages from man to woman, woman to sound, or woman to tree. The other, or the voice of the other, notes that each passage relies on distance and separation, unlike Deleuze's becomings, which are not part of a process with beginning or end. Lyotard's voice writes that separation is essential to representation. It is that which Narcissus cannot attain. Quote, "Without the work of this morning, there will be no representation." End quote. It's the same voice which earlier has meditated on the writer's task of representing the lines of a dummy. Quote, "What is that capacity of drawing? To escape from the letter." End quote. Separation, yes, but not resolution or satisfactory wish fulfillment. Rather, unfulfillment is the task of art. Lyotard's desire, like that of Deleuze, emphasises desire as force, but arrives at this by highlighting the instability and ambiguity in Freud's categorizations of desire. Lyotard suggests that Freud mistakenly assumes that desire as force, as manifest in the primary process, operates in the same machinic, end-driven manner as desire as wish. The inadequacy of this equivalent necessitates the reconfiguration and beyond the pleasure principle to include the death drive, which demonstrates the incapacity of desire to operate as a well-regulated machine. The death drive manifests desire not as fulfillment, but as intensity, which Lyotard regards as one of a disordering positivity. Therefore, when Lyotard analyses Freud's accounts of fantasy, he is actually emphasising the workings of the figural as desire powered by the non-signifying unbound forces of the death drive. So it's the workings of desire that are the consideration for Lyotard. Lyotard's concern is with the unfulfillment of desire, not of reconciliation. Hence his declaration that the task of art is, quote, "always to unmask all attempts to reconstitute a pseudo-religion," end quote. It is Deleuze and Guattari's rejection of the death drive which Lyotard highlights at the end of his own review of Anti-Oedipus, which is quite a significant essay in its own right called Capitalism and Ergo Men. Accepting the potential force of desire as a disorganising power, whose capacity is to produce the difference and alterity that disrupts machinic operations, Lyotard argues that the death drive is an essential part of desire because it models itself on disarticulation. Lyotard's reformulation of Freudian desire sees the death drive not as a separate drive, but as a product of the libidinal drive, which is necessary to its revolutionary potential. Such disorganising force is exemplified visually by the action painting of Jackson Pollock. Connections as well. And this is cited, again, both by Lyotard and Deleuze. Deleuze celebrates the chaotic excess of action painting, not for its opticality, but for its manual presence, which Deleuze calls the digital. Here we can also see another example of becoming. Following Harold Rosenberg's writings on Pollock in the essay Action Painting, Deleuze sees the artist becoming one with the painting, as should the viewer. For Lyotard, Pollock exemplifies the breaking out of representative norms through the transgression of good form to, quote, reveal the moment of desire itself, end quote. However, Francis Bacon's voice in Deleuze's book disagrees, in a manner that's similar to the voice of the other in Lyotard's essay on Adami. Bacon rejects abstract expressionism as being too much chaos. Sensation is rendered, but, quote, in an irredeemably confused state, end quote, and without the necessary evolution into figure through the establishment of fact, which comes from controlling and confining such moments within the contour. And as Deleuze writes of Bacon, save the contour, nothing is more important for Bacon than this. A line that delimits nothing still has a contour or outline itself. It's closer to the demand for separation in Adami and remind us of the initial definition of Bacon's figure as, quote, escaping the figurative through extraction or isolation. Bacon clears away the predictable images of figuration, aware that the blank sheet is never that. And for Deleuze, the matter of his paintings takes on their independence as percepts and affects which act independently as sensations, the forces which the artist works to control. The line that becomes letter is all that both Deleuze and Lyotard are left with. And yet, this can have been a line of desire. It is always already there, constituted as a line of flight in advance. So I celebrate that aspect of both these thinkers. The importance of maintaining the difference of the visual is central to each, and it is because of the sensitivity to the peculiarities of the visual that their writings strive to work with that difference rather than to reduce it to a written form. Both Deleuze and Lyotard work knowingly with the paradox of writing about art, evoking rather than capturing its force. And it is in wrestling with this dilemma that their approaches can be particularly rewarding. I will discuss two pieces in particular. No surprise, Deleuze's Francis Bacon, The Logic of Sensation, 1981, which is his most extensive writing on a single artist. And secondly, Lyotard's essay, It's As If a Line, which was originally written as a catalogue essay for an exhibition by the Italian artist Valerio Adami, and that's the catalogue. It was then subsequently incorporated into a publication from 1987 called Quependre. Although Lyotard wrote many pieces on contemporary artists, Adami has been chosen because it highlights aspects of separation and questioning which encapsulate the differing approaches of Lyotard and Deleuze, and necessitates a return to their earlier exchange at the time of the publication of Anti-Oedipus in 1972. Let's start with a Figural. In his book on Francis Bacon, we find as Lucy said, my name is Christopher Bamford, and the title of my paper, as you can see up there, is Finding the Figural in Deleuze and Lyotard. It's quite nice because, although I was anxiously waiting out there, that so many things have been highlighted already that I will recover. You know, it feels like we're already in comfortable territory, I hope. This paper will investigate an interrelation of many terms familiar to Deleuze's lexicon: sensation, bodies without organs, deterritorialization, or DT for anybody who's wants to do shorthand. But Deleuze also introduces the term figural, with specific reference to Lyotard's usage of the term in his doctoral thesis, 1971, Discours figure. This is how Deleuze introduces it. He says, painting has two possible ways of escaping the figurative: toward pure form through abstraction, or toward the purely figural through extraction or isolation. If the painter keeps to the figure, if he or she opts for the second path, it will be to oppose the relationship between the thought of Deleuze and his contemporary Jean-François Lyotard, specifically their writings on fine art, and as the title suggests, their use of the term figural. It's part of my PhD research into Lyotard's writings on art, and as such, this foray into Deleuzian territory constitutes a line of flight which has forced me to carefully consider the differences among many apparent similarities. Both thinkers write with art and artists, rather than about them. They give prominence to the ideas, statements, and working methods described, and as such privileged the role of the artist as enacting a different type of thought, but one analogous to the philosopher, which I love because I'm from practice background.